Renting for generations, it's been seen as just a pit stop on the way to that quarter-acre block. But as the dream of home ownership slips further out of reach for many, today there's a push to prepare for a new era of forever renters.
Say goodbye to the great Australian dream. Say hello to the forever renters.
Our housing market is set up in such a way that renting is supposed to be a temporary phenomenon for people before they buy their own home.
New research finding while nearly 80% want to own their own home, almost 60% of Aussie renters think they'll be renting for life.
That means there's a premium on tenure security, being able to call your house your home.
Renters prepared to pay $72 extra per week for an indefinite lease, $77 to cap rent increases to 5% a year, $127 extra to have a home that is above minimum standards.
The thought of having to find a new rental in this market is terrifying. I'm on one income with a small dependent child.
Jess and her 5-year-old son have been living in a rental for 4 years. She's required to renew her lease annually.
I tend to have a big panic around lease renewal time. It would be nice to have something that I could feel that ownership of and something that I could invest my time and energy into that I know I can have for as long as I wish.
Nearly 90% of renters are paying more than last year, mostly unable to save for the future. And the nation's rental sector is ageing. Over the last decade, the number of Aussies renting has increased in all capital cities across all ages, except those aged 80 and above.
So many parts of Australian life have been built around the presumption that most people will own their own home, particularly in retirement. Our age pension system, superannuation, our tenancy laws. But these things are going to be tested in a world where more people are renting for longer and many are renting for life.
So, with fewer Aussies holding hope of buying, how do we adjust to our new renting reality?
If I could secure a 10 or 15 year lease at the moment, I think that would be fantastic. And just know that I can plan out the next 5 or 10 years of my family and what my career looks like, what my son's education looks like. That would make a really big difference.
Well, housing and rental policy expert Michael Fotheringham is the man behind the numbers. He's with us now to discuss them. Michael, let's just go back to the context of all this. How do we know that we're not living in a moment of difficult rents as opposed to a drastic shift in the way that housing works in this country?
It's not just a blip. We've been seeing a trend a downward trend of home ownership for the last 10 or 15 years. We've seen house prices really increase much more rapidly than wages for several decades now. And as a result, people are just really struggling to get into home ownership. So increasingly, renters are really concerned that they'll never get there.
So should we be making it possible for people to rent forever?
Well, a lot of countries have long-term renting, but I guess one of the characteristics of the rental systems in Australia is that they're really based around an assumption of renting as a transitional tenure, something you do when you move out of your parents' home before you settle down and buy your own place, and really something you just do for a few years. But for a growing number of people, it's something they're doing for decades, and for many, it'll be lifelong. That means changes to the way we regulate rental markets. So what do we do about when investors want to sell properties? Well, what are the rules around evictions? What are the rules around security of tenure? So really making it safer for people to stay in renting long term.
So do you think that's the way we go about making it accessible for people to rent forever?
Well, there's two things we can do. We can try and turn this around and get people into home ownership. That involves a huge increase in supply, a much more rapid increase in supply than we're really able to do at this time. Or we can look at, even if we do that, that's going to take some time. We need to think about how do we make it a more viable tenure for Australians to live in renting long term. So, we need to do things like allowing pets. That's not a big ask. Have housing that's not unhealthy. We don't want to have black mould in houses. We want to have decent insulation, have decent standards for living for people who are renting.
Let's think about the landlords for a second. Most are mum and dad investors. I think above 70% of properties are owned by mum and dad investors. What if they can't afford to do some of the things that we're talking about here?
Well, in fact, it's way above 70%. 70% of the market is owned by investors who own just one investment property, and another 20% of that market is people who own just one or two. So it's a very spread market, a lot of very small scale investors. And yes, there are challenges for them in doing that, but we have tax settings that offset their losses, so negative gearing allows them to do that. We have a range of measures to support landlords, but we need to look at those reforms as well and think about, are they actually meeting the need they were designed for? We also need to look at the role of institutional investors, and Australia is unusual in that we don't have very many institutional investors in rental housing. It's all small-scale investors, really. It's less than 1% of the market is owned by institutional investors that invest at scale. And that leads to different behaviours too, because institutional investors tend to be structuring their finances around rental yield. They want stability, whereas the small-scale investors are thinking about capital gains and are more likely to flip the property at the right time.
Michael, thanks so much for sharing your thoughts.
Thank you.